U.S. government has issued a number of initiatives to make government data more widely accessible and useful, including the Federal Data Strategy, the Evidence Act, the Open Government Data Act, among others. For chief federal information, data, and technology officials, that has meant making concerted efforts to implement governance policies to transform data into more valuable products for their constituents and stakeholders. Here to take a closer look at those efforts and share some best practices are Laura Biven, Data Science Technical Lead in the Office of Data Science Strategy at National Institutes of Health, and John Auerbach, Senior Vice President for Public Health at ICF. Laura and John, welcome to the program. And Lauren, let me start with you. Would you briefly describe the scope of NIH's work and your responsibilities and some examples of how NIH works to make data more accessible and usable?
Sure. Thank you very much for the question and for inviting me here. Biomedical research is very much a data-rich science. And at NIH, we see our role as helping researchers access and use those data effectively. And so many of the institutes and centers across NIH steward and own their own data repositories where researchers can go to access really valuable data sets for their research. Across the NIH, we have a strategic plan for data science, which envisions a modernized and fair biomedical data ecosystem. And here, fair means findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data. And I work in the Office of Data Science Strategy, where we have the responsibility to implement that strategic plan. And so a lot of our work involves providing the connective tissue across the different repositories that are owned by the different entities across NIH. And so we work to develop the data services and the programs and the funding programs that will allow researchers to run workflows across those different repositories in the most effective ways possible.
And John, I'm curious to hear your perceptions about what progress you're seeing with health agencies at the federal as well as state and local levels in making data more accessible and usable.
Well, there are multiple efforts underway to make data more accessible as well as accurate and timely. Virtually all of the federal and the state health agencies are now engaged in activities to strengthen their data systems. And let me give you a few examples. CDC has established a new Center for Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics to help it better predict and manage emergencies of all kinds. And the center is going to model and evaluate forecasting efforts, establish and maintain data and analytics technology, and collaborate with state, local, tribal, and territorial leaders to support decision-making. Health Resources and Services Administration, or HRSA, is adapting its uniform data system, that's the data system that comes from the community health centers around the country, so that it is more aligned with the emerging US core data for interoperability standards. And that will allow the agency to better understand and share information about the characteristics and needs of 30 million people. And finally, I just would mention CMS because they're engaged in an initiative to ensure that both healthcare professionals and the public can easily find, access, and use important information, including information about the quality of care. And ICF is assisting them in this effort.
Well, Laura, I know there's certainly a lot of challenges, but I'm curious, what kinds of challenges are you still facing most in your position? And how have federal initiatives like the Federal Data Strategy and the Evidence Act, et cetera, how have they helped advance your efforts at NIH?
That's a great question. Interoperability is still very hard. Interoperability between data sets requires not just a sort of harmonization of the different types of data and the way that those data are organized, but also harmonization between the platforms where they live. So thinking about APIs and other standard ways to access the data that are consistent across different platforms. And that often requires a degree of consensus building across a number of different organizational entities. So the government policies that you mentioned are certainly incredibly helpful in terms of setting expectations for governments and for researchers in meeting some of those challenges.
And John, from your somewhat broader perspective in the health arena, what challenges are you also seeing? And again, how have initiatives like the Federal Data Strategy and other initiatives like it, how are they helping agencies manage data for broader public use?
Great question. Well, I highlight three major challenges, each of which I think is being worked on. The first is the need for sustainable resources. And because of COVID, there were a lot of funds that were made available to work on data, but some of these funds are one-time only, and we need to make sure that the funding is sustainable, because these aren't one-time only investments. We need to make sure that the data systems are both transformed, but then sustained. A second challenge that I've mentioned is the need to ensure that the workforce has the skills that are needed to transform and maintain the data and information systems. And this requires being able to attract and keep those with the needed skills, as well as to train existing members of the workforce. And this is a challenge because these positions are very competitive now. And finally, I mentioned that a major challenge is that the data modernization efforts aren't only needed at the federal level. Data systems also have to be updated, supported, and aligned at the state, local, tribal, and territorial levels in both the healthcare and the public health sectors. And given that there's a good deal of uneven capacity across the nation, this will require a lot of attention. To your point about is the federal strategy working, I think absolutely. In spite of these formidable challenges, the attention that's been brought to the vision for the future, but also these challenges, means that there is likely to be attention paid to them. And as I've indicated, there are many efforts underway to do just that.
Well, Laura, let's move from policy initiatives to the practical. What are some practical best practices that NIH has learned that other agencies might consider, especially in capturing greater intelligence out of data and then facilitating the use of things like APIs, for example, for data sharing?
So as I mentioned, I think interoperability of data assets is a really key component for us in terms of helping researchers gain the maximum insight possible out of the data that NIH stewards. And so we have a number of different programs and practices to help us make those data interoperable. NIH has been a bit ahead of the curve in terms of putting most of our data assets in the cloud, which allows many different resources, researchers to access those data regardless of where they are geographically, and to participate in large-scale collaborations around those data. We also have programs that are actively testing out different types of standards and APIs and tools that would help researchers search for data across the different repositories, as well as run workflows across them. So we have a number of different programs in place that are helping us advance that science. We also have some initiatives looking sort of far upstream in terms of how data are created. And here the emphasis on AI and machine learning has really proved to be a good motivator, where we're really looking at the skills and competencies that our biomedical research teams need to have in order to make the data that they create ready for AI and machine learning. And so that's another area of emphasis for us.
I appreciate your outlining those. And then, John, what additional or other best practices are you seeing in these areas that you might recommend?
Well, I think fortunately there are a number of best practices now, and I'll mention just a few. The first one really dovetails with what Laura has been saying, and that's the increasing federal practice of storing data in the cloud and utilizing FHIR standards. And that's laying the groundwork for standardization and interoperability. And just as one example, 75 out of CMS's 200 applications are already in the cloud. A second practice, though, that I'd highlight is the current work to update the U.S. core data for interoperability, or the standard questions that are asked in health and human services settings. The current efforts will reinforce the importance of consistency in the type of data that are collected, and it will also result in collecting certain types of data, for instance, data related to social determinants of health and data related to equity, in a widespread manner, and some of it will be for the first time. And then finally, I would draw attention to the groundbreaking workforce and infrastructure grant program that was recently initiated by the CDC. This is a kind of astounding $3.9 billion effort that includes support for hiring skilled data personnel at the state and local levels. The grant program combines support for data experts with a good deal of flexibility for states and locals to hire other personnel that are needed to prepare for the current and future public health needs.
Well, as an outside observer, certainly watching so many different entities through the pandemic makes incredible progress because of data sharing. Everything that you shared today certainly points us in the right direction on why it's increasingly important, not only for federal agencies, but for the public at large. So Laura Biven at NIH and John Auerbach at IC, thank you so much for joining us today, sharing some of your insights as well as some best practices around data sharing. So thank you for being with us.